give you some background, there's quite a lot of information about Dr. Venter and his work. And for the past several weeks, I've been trying to kind of dig into it and determine and find out and understand as much as I could in order to make this interview interesting and meaningful. And hopefully it'll turn out to be that way. If not, we still have the option where I'll give up and have Dr. Venter present anyway. So let's start there. I've been going through parts of your book, which I would imagine would be equal to a biography, an autobiography, which is a life decoded. And one of your colleagues quotes the way you operate as follows, and I'd like you to react to that. Craig likes to high dive into empty pools. He tries to time it so the water is there by the time he hits the bottom. Have you succeeded? You're still alive and sitting here, so you must have.
I haven't hit the bottom yet. I think that what that was referring to was I've been able to present my teams with what were considered impossible challenges. I knew they weren't impossible. And soon when the team started working on things, they learned they weren't impossible. They viewed their goal was to fill the pool with water and to prove me right. But as a result, I think people all rose to a level beyond which they thought they were capable. That's why instead of taking 15 years and $5 billion to sequence the human genome, we did it in 9 months, just with a small team of people for $100 million. Is applying new technology, new ideas. My team has never let me down. They keep filling the pool.
It's the analogy of the pool and water and diving. It's more than a coincidence because it's also a fact that Dr. Venter, in his earlier years, was a champion swimmer. Would you like to comment on that a little bit?
In the recent things with watching the Olympics, I couldn't carry the water bucket of the recent Olympic champions. So techniques and skill sets have changed very dramatically.
And the dress they wear.
Yes. So in fact, I've argued when you see people like Michael Phelps, on a genetic basis, it proves we're not all created equal.
That's true. Yes.
The Olympics is one way we emphasize this.
Yeah, especially that 8th medal that he won by 1/100th of a second, or even less than that, I believe. And all it involved was touching that one finger to that the end point, and that's how we won the 8th gold medal.
In fact, it's possible the other guy touched first, but he touched harder.
In your book you have written, I'm driven to seize life and understand it. What might be your quintessential findings in this regard?
Well, I think we're very early, hopefully early in that process, but what we've done is we've made a synthetic chromosome for a virus. We put the synthetic DNA into a cell, and the cell was able to read this synthetic chemical that we made and start producing the virus. Mm-hmm. What we reported earlier this year, we've now made something 100,000 times larger. We've made a first bacterial chromosome just from 4 bottles of chemicals. And we're in the process of trying to boot that up in a cell. But in showing that it is the software of life, we showed that we could actually take the genetic material, the chromosome, from one cell and put it in another cell, and with the right engineering so that the original chromosome in the cell was destroyed, we can completely convert one species into another. So we're at the early stages of understanding how DNA is in fact the software of life. We're at the earliest stages of learning how to write that software. And when we learn to write that software intelligently and able to design species from scratch, then we can claim as a species that we at least have some understanding of life.
So when you understand the genome of something and you're able to synthetically recreate it, I would imagine that's possible now. And if you were to do that, and then somewhere between that and life itself, is there a ghost in the machine, or there is no distance between putting the genome together and life spontaneously emerging?
Well, we're not creating life from scratch. We're doing what has happened with all life. All life comes from other living cells. That's how you and I started.
Right.
That's how all life starts. We're building on top of that 3.5 billion years of evolution by learning that we can just swap out the software.
Oh, I see. Okay.
And go much further than anybody imagined. So it's a totally different question of trying to create life from scratch from basic chemicals. And I think that's important to do in understanding the origins of life. But those aren't the steps that are going to take us dramatically to the next stages. We're trying to design cells right now, as Walter mentioned, to try and create new fuels from CO2 and sunlight.
Yeah, I was going to get into that.
We're trying to design new systems to do that, living systems that will self-replicate.
With regard to decoding your own genome, what I've gathered is that there has been a gene identified that demonstrates whether you have moist earwax or dry earwax. And in this case, you have determined that in your own genome it's moist, if I understand it correctly. What else have you found?
Well, that sort of sums up the status of our knowledge. In fact, the earwax was a particular fascination to Canadians. I've never understood
Really?
why. The Canadian press constantly talked about the earwax. But,
Very interesting.
But we're at the early stages, not of reading the genetic code. We now know how to do that, and we're scaling up to hopefully over this decade do 10,000 human genomes. The challenge is interpreting the genetic code.
As Walter was referring to, yes.
So in fact, that's the goal for trying to do thousands of genomes. So not only the genetic code, but we're trying to get complete phenotypic information on all these people. So we can do one of the biggest calculations ever in history and find out for the first time truly what is genetic and what's environmental, what's nature and what's nurture, what part of human existence is purely genetic or mostly genetic. Those are all answerable questions now. We have the technology, we have the interest to do it, and over whether it takes 1 decade or 2 or 3, within that time frame we will know most of these answers. That's a pretty exciting prospect. Right now we're staring at a lot of earwax.
Talking about nature and nurture, again, I referred to one of the statements that you have in your book, I believe. One of the most profound discoveries that I've made in all my research is that you cannot define a human life or any life based on DNA alone. Without understanding the environment in which cells or species exist, life cannot be understood. An organism's environment is ultimately as unique as its genetic code. Is this being apologetic? Is this being politically correct? Or is it truly something that is the case? That the environment and the genetics are inextricably linked and one cannot separate the other in understanding.
So one thing I like about the Kistler Prize, it's known for not going for political correctness.
Right. That's why the question.
Nobody's ever accused me of being politically correct or trying for it. It came from doing experiments and trying to interpret them. So in 1995, we sequenced the first 2 genomes of living organisms. And one of them had 500 genes and the other had 1,800. We just asked simple questions. Could we get down to a smaller, simpler genome and a simpler life form that might tell us about the origins of life? And so we started knocking out genes in this very small genome. In fact, it's the same one that we made synthetically earlier this year. trying to understand if we could, the cell could live without certain genes. And what we found, instead of that we could get down to the secret genetic code for life, we discovered that the genetic code is only half of the equation, and the environment is the other half. It's a very simple experiment. The cell will live on 2 sugars, glucose and fructose. And there's a gene that encodes a cell surface transporter for each sugar. So if you knock out the gene for the glucose transporter and you have fructose in the media, the cell happily lives because it could live off of fructose. And so if you were coding things, you would say that glucose transporter is not an essential gene for life. But if you do the same experiment now and you only have glucose in the media, you knock out the glucose transporter gene, the cell dies. And you'd say under those conditions, it's essential for life. The difference is not in the genes, it's in what's in the environment.
I see.
So we have to define the environment and we have to define the genes. This is for the most simple cell we know in history. Just think how complex it is for you and I with 100 trillion cells and 23,000 genes in each cell. So the environment is critical. It was a very humbling experiment as a molecular biologist working on the genetic code, thinking we could define life on that basis. Now we know we can't.
Can't, I see. This is an area that not much is probably been explored, having to do with knowing what you know about genomics, even at this early stage. What are the potentials for weaponizing in terms of biological warfare, agricultural sabotage, and things like that?
Well, those are issues that obviously are...
Is it possible?
It certainly is possible. You know, humanity's been using biological warfare for a long time. The early stages of this country, British troops would put smallpox-laden blankets out to kill the Indians. That's biological warfare.
Yeah.
We've seen it in even more recent history. You don't need to be able to engineer the genome to try and do harm to others. We saw that with the anthrax attacks. Humans, as we know, looking back in history, have a pretty sad history in terms of violence against our fellow humans. Could this technology be used for that? Yes. But everybody that's looked at the question, so there's so many different readily available things. Any farm can give you anthrax, for example, that there's no need to try and weaponize genomics. But as we can design the genetic code, as we can make it, we can bring back extinct species.
Right.
So that's now been done with the third virus that was made. The 1918 flu virus was reconstructed in the laboratory. It was almost a true Jurassic Park scenario of RNA was isolated from a virus of a soldier that died in 1918.
Wow.
And his tissues were kept in Washington. And from a woman who died in 1918 and was buried in the permafrost. So the RNA was still intact in her lungs. The RNA was isolated from the 1918 flu virus and sequenced. And looking at the sequence, none of us looking at it could tell why that virus was so virulent, why it killed so many people, and even how to build a vaccine against it. So using these synthetic processes, it was reconstructed at the CDC in Atlanta. And now we know what parts lead to the lethal effects of it. And new vaccines are already in development that hopefully could prevent another pandemic. But that's a species that everybody thought had completely disappeared and was brought back by synthetic techniques. So science fiction scenarios that we all thought were science fiction are potentially doable.
If I understand correctly, I think it was Japanese scientists who are trying to do the same with the mastodon or the woolly mammoth or something that was found buried in the Siberian ice.
Well, DNA from woolly mammoths is being isolated. It hasn't been sequenced yet. In Germany, we're getting the sequence of Neanderthals.
Yeah.
Like we don't have enough in Washington already.
This is something we were discussing yesterday. Do you think Neanderthals and modern humans not only interacted but cohabited and reproduced?
So I got drafted, as you know, in my book and was in the Navy.
Yeah.
My view, if they coexisted after what I saw in the Navy,
They certainly reproduced.
They certainly tried to reproduce.
That's what I was telling Walter the other day, saying you just walk around and you see many that resemble some mixture of both. You know.
But the evidence right now from the limited genetic information is there's no evidence of crossbreeding, but it's still early,
too early
with what we know.
What would you guess?
It's more unusual if they didn't. They coexisted in time. If they coexisted geographically,
Quite possible.
you know, it's possible that there's enough molecular differences in the sperm and egg recognition that even if they tried, they weren't able to reproduce. That's a possibility. As I said, from what I saw in the military, if they coexisted, they tried.
One of your contemporaries, and I'm not sure I would describe the situation as a colleague, perhaps a competitor, in the process of doing approximately similar things, walked into a forest and saw the mind of God. What about you?
I think he found magic mushrooms.
I'm referring, of course, to Francis Collins, who worked along in similar time frames to do what he already did, and the race was won by Dr. Venter, if I'm putting it correctly. See?
I don't think we need religion to explain science.
Okay.
We may need science to explain religion.
I'll have to think about that. You see. Again, in terms of going into that realm a little bit more, progressively, we as humans have been decentered and destructured in terms of our own importance relative to everything else around us. How do you think we are handling it, and how do you think the scenario will unfold?
I'm not sure I agree with the statement. You can't turn on television without either seeing Britney Spears or Governor Palin right now.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, so it's we do just the opposite with how we treat people and trying to make them see far more important than they actually are. So I don't think we're decentralized at all as a species. We're constantly expanding. The challenge is over the next 40 years, we're going to go from roughly 6.7 billion to maybe 9.5 billion people. Mm-hmm. That certainly dilutes things out. So the numbers I use, I was born in 1946. There's now
just a young kid.
There's now 3 people alive for everybody existed the year that I was born.
That's right.
And soon there will be 4.
Yeah.
Humanity has never faced this kind of expansion in
Mm-hmm.
population, testing the limits of everything that we know about in society, the limits of what our planet can absorb. So I think those are the fundamental challenges we're facing.
So earlier on you referred to, I believe, the ability for humans to take over evolution. How do you think that's going to intersect vis-a-vis what you just said, which is having taken over human evolution, here we're breeding and we're going to be 9 billion soon, and having taken over evolution, what are we doing to the environment if we are doing something to it? Is this a good idea, taking over evolution?
Well,
or is it just simply a delusion that we are?
Well, it's not clear yet how fast we can take over human evolution. My view is we have to take over evolution if we're going to survive. We have to find alternatives to burning oil and coal.
Yeah.
We're taking, as probably we'll hear over the next few days, roughly, I think the numbers now are roughly 4.2 billion tons of CO2 that remain added to the atmosphere each year, just from burning this ancient carbon. We're not going to have enough clean water, enough food, and enough fuel for all this new humanity unless we change what we do. I was at the meeting in Davos in January, and the consensus was there's basically nothing in the next 40 years of new technologies, wind, solar, that could have more than a few percentage differences. The only wild card, if we can harness biology to produce fuels from the sun or from other approaches. So the only true game changer that we have in the near future is biology.
So yeah, I think it was in the TED presentation that you had discussed the fact that in about 18 months, if I'm not mistaken, you would have an alternative in terms of energy. Would you care to elaborate on that?
But the important thing, I didn't say 18 months from when.
But anyway, I'm more interested in the technology so that people here can understand what the mechanics, what the biology is, how the elements come together. Walter was referring to it in terms of some chemical ingredients and photosynthesis and biology and stuff. Enlighten me on that.
So we have a number of different approaches we're taking at a company called Synthetic Genomics. One, we have a major program with BP where we're looking at life deep in the earth. So with the Sorcerer expedition, we found new life all around in the oceans. This time we went a mile deep in the earth, found 50 to 70 million year old water. And the question is, would there be life there, and how much life would there be?
This is in the core, not the oceans.
That's right.
A mile into the core of the earth.
That's right.
Okay.
There was more life there, a higher density, more diversity than we find in the
How
oceans.
hot is it down there?
It's less than 100 degrees centigrade.
That's it? Okay. All right.
We know now biology, the world's record is 116 degrees centigrade, I think, for an organism that's its optimal temperature. So the estimations are there's more life beneath the crust than in the oceans. And these organisms, we have large numbers of them that live off of coal, break down the coal and produce methane.
Right.
In fact, most of the methane from coal to methane and the methane that's in coal mines that causes all the problems is biological. So we're understanding these processes to see if we can speed them up quite substantially. You get about a 10-fold improvement of going from mining coal and burning it versus biologically converting it into natural gas. And that's one huge reserve, but it's still taking old carbon out of the ground and eventually adding it to the atmosphere. So we have programs where we're changing the genetic code of different types of cells using different processes. So we have some that go from sugar to make gasoline or diesel fuel directly. We have others, as Walter described, we're going from sunlight and CO2 to making chemicals that could go right into a diesel engine, right into a jet engine without any purification or refining. That the challenge will just be the CapEx for building the fields to grow these and the apparatus for doing it and harvesting these. It's an embarrassment in this country. We put a tiny fraction of the federal science budget towards any of these problems. And it's only because there's private capital available to try these new things that we even have any approach to it. These are obviously hot campaign issues, but the government's done virtually nothing about energy other than wanting to drill more oil wells. We could start, and there's lots of groups with different solutions based on different biological engineering to change manufacturing in this country and around the world. This is hardly even being discussed, let alone people recognizing this is a transformational period that within 10 years the equation could be totally different.
If the starting point of the 18-month was today, are you on track?
We're actually getting ready to build our first pilot facility, starting building in January. So
Wow.
we hope to have something going on scale, but let's not lose track of the scale.
Yeah.
If we built a micro refinery that could make 20,000 liters a day from sunlight or from sugar, we need 1 million of those refineries to replace what we do every day with oil. It's a huge challenge. Biology is scalable, which is why theoretically it's one of the few things that could work. But coming up instantly with 1 million refineries that could do this is a big challenge.
One of the things I've always wondered about, and I don't know about everybody else in the room, what are the tools of a geneticist? Like a biologist or a chemical, somebody studying chemistry, I can walk into a lab, there's a Bunsen burner, there's pipettes and tubes and different liquids and so on. What are the basic tools of a geneticist?
Well, there's different types of geneticists, but the
In your
essential
field,
tool
yeah.
that we use is the computer.
Okay.
We've digitized the genetic code. We're now taking the genetic code back out of the computer, and we can then, from these 4 bottles of chemicals, synthesize those molecules in the lab and come up with new pathways to do these processes. But if you look at a lab, they're extremely ordinary. People using micropipettes. We have robots that do some things. We have some pretty amazing instruments. But it's mostly what happens in people's minds and using the data in the computer and transforming that in the lab.
I see. So it's mostly having to do with models and simulations and...
No, there's no simulations. It's just it's doing
actual
design
manipulation.
and then the chemistry to build things.
Ah, okay.
But because you can build it once at a micro scale, and with the replication of biology, you can make billions or trillions of copies of the same thing.
One of the things you have said is as people start to get genotyped, they'll be able to take control of their lives. Our database will allow them to know their future. Technological implications of each of us carrying a card with our genome as it relates to health, behavior, and intelligence.
I said that very early on.
Very early on. Are you would you like to restate that? Or?
Well, I certainly think we won't know the genetic code for intelligence. But what we will know is things like risk for heart disease, risk for some types of cancer. Only about 3 to 5% of cancers, though, are actually genetic in terms of what we would inherit from our parents. Most cancer is genetic in terms of genetic damage accumulated during a lifetime from smoking, radiation, chemical damage, etc. One example, statins are clearly a preventative medicine. Depending on whether you know your risk from family history, eventually we'll know the real risk for each of us from our genetic code for heart disease and stroke. Some of the latest data is on prostate cancer. There's a clear genetic predictability of prostate cancer in men. There is a drug that can be given to prevent prostate cancer. It doesn't make any sense to give it to the whole population, but by doing genetic tests, you're in the group for that increased risk. Like a statin, it could make sense for you to take that preventative medicine. The future of medicine is going to be preventing diseases, avoiding them. We have a society that both in medicine and how we respond to everything in society is we want to instantly fix problems that have occurred. We're not very good at preventing the problems. And that's what we have to learn how to do. That's what the genetic code can help teach us for those components that are genetic.
So if you were a betting man, what time frames would you assign approximately for instance, the fact that medicine as we know it will change radically?
Well, medicine is very hard to change. Recent studies have shown that less than 50% of physicians in this country practice the accepted standard of care. So even if you know something, it's hard to change medicine.
I see.
So that's one type of challenge. We have to teach insurance companies, governments, and third-party payers that it's cheaper for them to prevent diseases than to treat them afterwards. That's a social challenge
Yeah.
and a mathematical challenge and an argument much more than anything else. I'm part of the X Prize. We have a $10 million prize right now for whoever gets the technology for rapidly sequencing human genomes for around $1,000. There's at least 2 companies now looking like they might have something in a couple of years. So instead of costing $5 billion in the federal program or $100 million in the program at Celera, we're now doing human genomes for roughly $1.5 million. But if we get it down to it's 1,500, all of a sudden doing tens of thousands, tens of millions will be possible. And that's when medicine will start to change once we have that data.
Looking at a 1,000-year time frame, do you suppose it be reasonable to think or expect that humans can be understanding the genomics, can be tailored or engineered for habitation in other environments outside of the Earth?
Are we talking about blue states or red states?
I'm talking about the blue yonder states up there. See, I'm talking typically maybe for space. See.
Well, some have argued, and I've heard some of those arguments tonight. Humanity's only choice is to leave this planet.
Yes.
And many people have argued that. Some have argued there's 2 choices: leaving the planet, or changing the genetic code. I think we actually have other options if we start adopting them quickly. Is change how we deal with things on the planet, find alternate energy sources quickly, and make it so we can survive, so that 1,000 years from now people here can have that discussion intelligently. I think that's possible, not at the rate we're going though.
Yeah, if you have observed, Dr. Venter, I haven't taken the bait on any of the statements regarding blue and red or anything else, or the personalities involved in the current elections. I would love to continue that conversation outside this framework, and that's primarily because the foundation is prohibited from politically getting involved in any sort of discussion about the future. Our primary focus is on science. Is there any question that I should ask that I didn't?
Yes.
Please.
Well, I'm not going to tell
What
you.
might that be? Well, Dr. Venter, thank you very much.
Thank you.